When I met my fiance's parents, her mother didn't even wait for the appetizers. She stood up, looked me dead in the eyes, and threw a glass of red wine straight into my face. And while the room froze, she said, "That's to disinfect a poor boy. Pay $100,000 if you want to marry my daughter." The wine was cold. Her voice was colder. But what cut deepest wasn't her, it was hearing my fiancé laugh. So I wiped my face, looked right at them, and said, "Then I'm canceling every contract with your company." And that was the night everything collapsed, and somehow, the night I finally found myself. My name is Alistair Holt, and this is not a story about losing love or business. It's a story about what happens when a man raised in dust and debt refuses to let anyone put a price tag on him ever again. Before I share my story with you, I'd love to know you're here with me. Drop a simple hi in the comments so I know you're listening. Or tell me where you're watching from. I truly love seeing how far my story can reach. Sometimes knowing someone is out there makes all the difference. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. And if my story touches you, even just a little, hit subscribe. It helps this channel reach more people who need a voice, a moment of strength, or simply a story that says you're not alone. I was 32 years old when I boarded the late afternoon flight from Denver to Phoenix, the kind of flight where half the passengers were business travelers and the other half were retirees escaping the cold. I stared out the window as the Rockies faded into a sheet of desert bronze, trying to steady my breathing. In a few hours, I'd be in Scottsdale shaking hands with the parents of my fiancée, Marina Whitford. On paper, it was supposed to be simple: meet the family, have dinner, be polite. In reality, I knew I was walking into a house where every square inch radiated the kind of old money scrutiny that could crush a man who wasn't born into it. I'm Alistair Holt, founder and CEO of Holt Dynamics, a tech firm that keeps half the manufacturing plants in the Midwest from collapsing under their own inefficiency. And the Whitfords. Their company, Whitford Industrial Components, is my biggest client. Charles Whitford. Marina's father depends heavily on the systems my company built. Losing their business wouldn't just dent quarterly numbers, it would impact the company's stability. So while I was preparing to meet my future in-laws, I was also very aware that if anything went wrong tonight, I could lose both a relationship and a multi-million-dollar partnership in one blow. That thought sat in my chest like a stone. Some part of me knew this dread came from farther back than business or marriage. It came from Pueblo, the dry, wind-whipped town where I grew up in a house with chipped paint and a window unit AC that rattled like it was begging for mercy. My father would come home smelling like Freon and dust fingers scraped from another day fixing systems no one else wanted to touch. My mother smelled of antiseptic from 12-hour nursing shifts. Dinner was always simple pasta, canned vegetables, frozen chicken if we were lucky. What wasn't simple were the bills, gas, car insurance, medical debt. I grew up listening to my parents whisper and argue under their breath about how far a paycheck could stretch. But none of that shaped me like my brother did. He was the one who believed we'd escape. He used to climb onto the roof with me at night, pointing to planes leaving contrails across the sky. "One day we'll be up there," he'd say. "Not stuck here. Not forever." We made a promise on that roof to get out to build something to see a world bigger than Pueblo. And then one winter night, he never came home. The call said he'd been in a wreck on the highway outside town. By the time we reached the hospital, the emergency doors were already closing. I remember the words the doctors used, words that branded themselves into the back of my skull: not covered, critical condition, too late. My parents aged years in days. At the small graveside service, with the sky low and gray, I stood over his casket and made a vow I've repeated in my head 1,000 times: I will not stay here forever. I will walk into places no one thinks I belong, and I will make sure no one ever gets to put a price tag on me again. That vow became the engine of my life. I studied like my life depended on it, because it did. I spent every free minute in the high school library chasing scholarships like a starving dog. When I got into the University of Colorado Boulder, my parents drove me there in the old Buick that rattled at 70 miles per hour. In the parking lot, my mom pressed a folded 20 into my palm, knowing it was more than she could spare. My dad squeezed my shoulder and said, "Go as far as you can, son. But don't forget who you are. College was cramped dorm rooms, a second-hand laptop ramen, and all-nighters. But it was also where Holt Dynamics was born, three broke kids writing the first lines of code for a system we believed could change how factories worked. After graduation, we set up a 2-room office in Denver with peeling carpet, and slowly, one plant at a time, companies started trusting us. The real turning point came at an automation conference in Phoenix where I met Charles Whitford. He was in his early 60s, polished but tired in the way CEOs of aging companies often are. He watched one of my demonstrations, then approached me afterward with a firm handshake and an invitation to Scottsdale. I didn't know it then, but stepping onto the Whitford factory floor for the first time would be the beginning of a story that mixed business, family loyalty, and betrayal more tightly than anything I'd ever experienced. Now, sitting on a plane heading toward that same family, toward the woman I loved, I stared down at the mountains and desert below, realizing how far I'd come. From Pueblo to Denver to Arizona, from a boy with nothing to a man about to walk into a sandstone mansion that people like me weren't meant to enter. I thought about the moment I proposed to Marina on the edge of Dillon Reservoir, the way she said yes through tears, and the mother I'd never met who now waited behind that front door. And I admitted something I'd barely had the courage to whisper even to myself. I believed the hardest part of this trip would be convincing Marina's mother that I was worthy of her daughter. I had no idea that before the night ended, I would be the one ending a legacy her father had spent his entire life building. Before Marina, my days in Denver followed a predictable rhythm: mornings in the office, reviewing data pipelines from Midwest plants, afternoons and meetings nights, eating microwaved meals in my apartment before prepping for the next day. Weekends were for hiking switchbacks, snow-dusted trails, the quiet kind of peace you can only find above 10,000 feet. I'd tried dating apps a few times, but conversations always seemed to collapse into the same questions. What do you do? What's your revenue? Are you the founder? It felt less like dating, and more like interviewing candidates for a life I wasn't sure I wanted. Then one afternoon, Charles called and invited me to Scottsdale to discuss expanding Whitford's systems. I assumed it was business, maybe a negotiation. I didn't know he had another agenda. The first time I saw Marina, she walked into the glass-walled conference room after our system demo. She had the kind of poise that didn't need designer labels to announce itself: minimalist clothes, hair pulled back, eyes sharp and steady. Charles introduced her as the head of innovation projects for the Whitford Group. I hadn't expected the daughter of an industrial dynasty to spend time analyzing bottlenecks in factory floors or talking about tech adoption curves, but she did, and she did it well. She asked the kind of questions only people who actually walked the floor would know to ask. Could our system improve traceability without cutting jobs? How would our algorithms handle inconsistent shifts? She wasn't showing off, she genuinely understood the work. It hit a part of me that still remembered my mom bringing home stories of exhausted night shift nurses and my dad patching rusty units because small businesses couldn't afford replacements. Marina wasn't pretending to care, she cared. After the meeting, Charles invited me to dinner at a resort restaurant. Over grilled salmon and iced tea, he said casually, "A self-made guy like you. That's rare in my daughter's world." I laughed it off, assuming he was just being kind. What I didn't realize was that he wasn't just talking about business anymore. He was floating the idea of me as someone who could anchor Marina, someone real, amid the polished, wealthy circles she'd grown up in. Marina texted me the next day, then again the day after. Before long, we were coordinating flight schedules, meeting in Phoenix rooftops overlooking the glowing desert skyline. She'd point to buildings and tell me which ones her family's network owned or invested in. Then she'd turn and ask me questions about Pueblo, how two brothers used to lie on the roof and talk about leaving. Sometimes she flew to Denver for a weekend, and I'd walk her through the snowy streets near Union Station or take her to the tiny coffee shop that fueled most of Holt Dynamics' early days. She existed between two worlds with an ease I envied. She could discuss corporate growth strategies one moment and ask gently about the brother I lost the next. For the first time in years, I felt seen deeply enough to share that story. But cracks showed earlier than I admitted. One night in Denver, I took her to an old burger joint I'd loved in college. She looked around, half-smiled, and said, "I get why you dress so simple now." It stung in a way I didn't fully understand at the time. Another night at a luxury hotel in Phoenix, a staff member mistook me for one of their tech guys because I wasn't dressed like a guest. Marina laughed, teasing, "Guess you don't have the VIP vibe yet." Her smile was playful, but the words slid under my skin like thin blades. The real shift came months later during a casual conversation with Charles. He mentioned almost accidentally that the only reason Whitford's board approved the expanded contract with Holt Dynamics was because Marina had pushed for it behind the scenes. "She believed in your company before the rest of us," he said. That sentence hit harder than it should have. It meant Marina had researched us before ever meeting me, had advocated for Holt because she knew her father's company needed our systems. It made me wonder whether she'd chosen me the same way, strategically, deliberately, with an eye on what I could offer. Then again, by that point, I cared for her more than I cared for the originality of our beginning. So I buried the concern, chalked it up to coincidence, and told myself that even if the beginning was calculated, the middle was real. I let myself believe in the version of her who listened to my brother's story with glassy eyes and kissed me like she meant it. But as I closed that chapter in my memory, still seated on the plane descending into Phoenix, I acknowledged something I'd never said out loud. The first fracture in our relationship had appeared the moment I realized I might be both the man she loved and the asset her family needed. I saw the crack, and instead of addressing it, I covered it with hope. That was the first rule. I broke the rule I'd sworn at 16, never let anyone use my life as a bargaining chip, no matter how beautiful the wrapping looked. I planned the proposal at Dillon Reservoir down to the smallest detail, even though I tried to pretend it was spontaneous. I'd spent the entire week checking the weather, rehearsing what I wanted to say, and convincing myself that if I chose the right setting, everything else would fall into place. The lake was glassy that afternoon, mirroring the Rockies stretched across the sky like a painted backdrop. The sunlight hit the water with a soft gold shimmer, and the wooden dock creaked beneath our feet as the wind carried the smell of pine from the shoreline. I'd packed a picnic basket, a blanket, a couple of sandwiches, and the engagement ring that had burned a hole in my pocket for days. What I didn't pack but brought with me anyway was the story of my brother and the part of my past I'd never fully shared with anyone outside my family. As we sat on the dock, Marina leaned her head on my shoulder, her hair lifting slightly with the breeze. There was something calm and steady about her presence that made honesty feel possible. Maybe that was why I chose that moment to open the door I usually kept sealed. I told her about the winter night when my brother's life changed so suddenly, how the hospital bill became part of the conversation before we even knew if he would survive. How helpless I'd felt listening to words like "not covered," and how standing at his graveside I'd sworn I would never again let money determine the value of someone's life. Then I told her the fear that still clung to me even as an adult. The thing I hate most is when people look at me like they're doing me a favor. Like I don't belong. Marina wrapped her arms around me tightly, whispering that I didn't have to prove anything to her. She said it with a certainty that made me believe she understood what that vow had cost me over the years. For a moment, the weight in my chest eased. When I finally knelt down and pulled the ring from my jacket, her eyes filled instantly. I didn't give a long speech. I just told her I wanted a life with her, not built on deals or shared interests or aligned family expectations, but on something real. She said yes before I finished the sentence, pulling me up so fast we nearly fell off the dock. The world felt quiet after that, the kind of quiet where everything finally makes sense. We were still wrapping up our picnic when her phone rang. I wasn't paying attention at first until I heard a voice blaring through the speaker, sharp-clipped and unmistakably irritated. Marina fumbled to switch off the speakerphone, but not before I caught fragments. Who is he, and where did he grow up, and what's his net worth? The disdain in those questions was almost physical. Marina stepped away to finish the conversation, pacing with her free hand pressed to her forehead. When she returned, she gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "My mom's just dramatic," she said. "She'll be fine." She said it quickly, as if speed could erase what I'd heard. I didn't push. I wanted the night to stay beautiful a little longer. On the drive back to Denver, the sky was dark and the road nearly empty when Marina broke the silence. Hypothetically, she said, if we ever got married, would it bother you if we each contributed financially to the wedding? Like a big gesture to show commitment. Her tone was light, but her fingers kept tapping the window in a restless rhythm. I told her honestly, I'm not paying money to be allowed into a family. I'll pay for what we build together, but not for permission. She laughed it off and said it was just a thought experiment, but the way she avoided looking at me made me wonder who had planted that question in the first place. A few nights later, she sat on my couch with a glass of wine and admitted something she'd danced around for months. I looked up your company before we ever met, she said. Dad sent me files on your systems. I knew Holt Dynamics was growing fast. I knew you were important to Whitford's future. But I didn't expect to like you as a person. That part wasn't planned. Her honesty was both comforting and unsettling. Part of me appreciated the truth. Another part felt like I had been evaluated, categorized, and chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with who I actually was. But I didn't let myself linger on that feeling. I decided her affection was real enough now, and that had to be what mattered. So when she asked if I'd fly to Scottsdale next month to meet her parents and talk about wedding plans, I said yes. I didn't tell the Holt Dynamics board that I was engaged to the daughter of our largest client. I framed the trip as strategic relationship maintenance, not personal. In my mind, I believed everything was finally aligning love-work stability. I didn't realize that while I felt settled somewhere in Scottsdale, negotiations about the price of joining their family were already being discussed without me. That thought would come back to haunt me later. For now, I let myself believe things were simple, that the world was finally softening for me. But under that surface, the ground was already beginning to shift. Returning to Denver after the proposal felt surreal, like I was walking through my own life with a slight delay. Everything looked the same: my apartment, the office, the view of the skyline, but nothing felt the same. Marina's yes had settled into my chest with a warm certainty. I caught myself staring at her ring during Zoom meetings with Charles and his management team, feeling a strange blend of pride and unease. Was I speaking as a partner, as a future son-in-law, as a vendor whose technology their factories depended on? The boundaries began to blur, and I told myself it was natural. Love comes with merging worlds. I thought all I had to do was prove myself, and the rest would fall into place. Marina, however, began to shift in ways I hadn't expected. One night over dinner, she gently suggested I update my wardrobe. Not dramatically, just a nicer watch, a more tailored suit, fewer rough edges in the way I spoke. Mom pays attention to presentation, she explained. Once she warms up to you, everything will get easier. The implication that I needed polishing hit my pride harder than I wanted to admit, but I swallowed the discomfort. I told myself she was helping me navigate a world she knew better than I did. Then she brought up the first hint of money. We were sitting in my car outside her apartment when she said my mom thinks of marriage as a partnership, both sides contributing something substantial, a sign of commitment. She paused. If she asked for something like $100,000 as a gesture, how would you feel? The number hit me like cold water. I didn't yell, didn't argue. I just said the truth. I'm not paying to marry you. She nodded quickly and said it was only a hypothetical, but I saw something flicker in her expression, anxiety calculation, something I couldn't name. A few days later, another crack appeared. We were watching TV on my couch when her phone buzzed with a group chat notification. Before she could turn the screen away, I saw messages pop up. Where exactly did he grow up? Pueblo really makes sure he understands the 100K thing before he steps into the house. He'll probably gape at the staircase. Marina slammed her phone down, cheeks flushed. I didn't confront her immediately, but the messages looped in my mind. Later that night, I asked, "What does your family really think of me?" She brushed it off, saying they just needed time and tended to exaggerate. But the evasion spoke louder than any explanation she could have given. Pressure mounted from another front, too. My CFO emailed requesting an emergency board meeting. When we gathered in the conference room, he laid out the numbers. Whitford accounted for an unhealthy portion of our revenue. Losing them would destabilize us. Depending on them too heavily could also put us at risk. One of my co-founders looked me in the eye and asked, "Are you sure this relationship isn't affecting your judgment?" For the first time, I felt those two parts of my life colliding: my loyalty to Marina and my responsibility to the company I'd built from nothing. I defended Marina in that meeting, but internally, another fracture formed. Later that week, Marina broke down when I told her about the board's concerns. She admitted that her mother had always controlled the family through money, how even Charles bowed to her decisions, how disagreeing with her could mean social exile within their own circles. She told me she lived in constant fear of disappointing her mother. Hearing that softened me. I saw not a princess, but someone who had grown up under a kind of pressure I'd never known. I wanted to protect her from that weight. And somewhere in that desire, I started bending in ways I had once sworn I never would. By the end of the chapter of my life, as I lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized I had framed everything as a battle between me and Evelyn Whitford. I thought if I could win her approval, everything else would fall into place. What I didn't yet understand was that the real conflict was much closer living inside me. One part of me was still the boy from Pueblo who refused to let anyone buy or belittle him. The other part was the man willing to compromise pieces of himself to keep a relationship and a contract intact. That tension would only grow as the days toward Scottsdale drew closer, stretching until something in me finally had to break. There were days when I felt like I was living two separate lives and both were pulling at me from opposite ends. In Denver, I sat in the glass conference room at Holt Dynamics, the room where we'd pitched investors, launched products, and mapped out expansion plans. In Scottsdale, I sat in the Whitford's polished mahogany boardroom listening to projections for the very factories my company helped modernize. Same man, same brain, same responsibilities, but depending on the room I walked into, I was either the strategic CEO or the son-in-law to be who needed to play his part with grace. What unsettled me most wasn't the pressure. It was how everyone spoke about me as if I were a tool, something to be positioned carefully for maximum benefit. Each side had their logic. Holt Dynamics wanted stability without dependence. Whitford wanted reassurance that I wasn't using Marina to climb. Everyone had a stake in my decisions. No one asked what I actually wanted. During a work trip to Scottsdale, Charles invited me to lunch without Marina. He chose a quiet country club restaurant tucked between palm trees and immaculate lawns. When the server left us with iced tea and grilled chicken salads, Charles put down his fork and leaned back in his chair. "I want to propose something bigger," he said. "A multi-year integration across all Whitford plants. Long-term licensing, guaranteed support, shared R&D. It was generous, almost too generous. He mentioned numbers that made my head spin, then added, "If you become family, it'll be easier. The board will trust you more if our futures are tied together by more than contracts." The way he said become family wasn't romantic. It was strategic. That was the moment everything snapped into focus. He wasn't just supporting my relationship with Marina, he was betting Whitford's survival on Holt Dynamics, and he wanted me locked into his world so tightly that I couldn't walk away without consequences. When Marina arrived in Denver a week later, she brought what she called wedding planning notes. It wasn't a notebook, it was a full binder. Guest lists, budgets, timelines, vendor options. At first I thought she was just being organized. Then I saw the line item labeled contribution from groom's side with a blank space next to it. I asked her what it meant. She hesitated, then tried to soften the blow. "My mom wants a gesture, something that shows you're committed. She thinks a financial contribution makes everything clear and clean." "Clear and clean," I repeated. She swallowed. She mentioned $100,000. The number didn't shock me as much as the phrasing because Marina admitted it just as she had heard it, a way to disinfect a poor boy. Hearing that phrase in her voice made my skin crawl. I felt my brother's memory push its way into the conversation, uninvited and undeniable. I saw the hospital bills, the paycheck stubs, the vow I'd made at 16. Marina cried when I pushed back. She insisted her mother wasn't being cruel, she was being protective. She said if I didn't pay, her mother would twist the story so I looked like a gold digger trying to marry into the family to get access to Whitford. She said she couldn't stand the humiliation. I asked her, "What do you think, you not your mother? Do you believe I'm here for the money?" Her silence cut deeper than anything Evelyn had ever said. The next blow came from my own side. Holt's CFO requested a special meeting. He shared risk reports showing how dangerously dependent we'd become on Whitford. One of my co-founders said bluntly, "If marrying Marina means Whitford gets their hands deeper into our operations, we need to rethink everything." Sitting in that meeting, I felt exposed as if my personal life had become a liability for the very company I'd built from dust and debt. And the worst part? They weren't wrong. Later that night, Marina tried to offer a compromise. "Just agree to the number," she said softly. "We can funnel it through a joint charity fund. It will look good. It'll calm my mom down. It's only temporary." She said it like we were solving a logistical problem, not asking me to purchase legitimacy. A part of me, one I barely recognized, almost agreed. Not because I wanted Evelyn's approval. Not because I feared losing business, but because I didn't want to lose Marina. For a brief, shameful moment, I considered betraying the vow I'd held since I was 16. That night, I stood alone on my balcony staring at the Denver skyline. The lights blurred slightly, not from tears, but from exhaustion. I thought about the boy I used to be, the one who'd stood in a cemetery promising he'd never let anyone decide his value again. And now here I was, debating whether paying $100,000 to marry someone counted as survival or surrender. In the end, I booked the flight to Scottsdale. I told myself I needed to see everything clearly with my own eyes before making any decision. But deep down, I knew something in me would break on that trip, and whatever cracked might never go back to how it was before. The flight from Denver to Phoenix felt heavier this time, as if the air itself knew what waited for me in Scottsdale. I wasn't traveling as a CEO heading to a client meeting. I was flying into a test one that had nothing to do with technical systems or integration plans. The number $100,000 pulsed in my mind like a warning siren. The closer we got to Arizona, the more I wondered whether agreeing would make me cowardly or disloyal to everything that had shaped me. As the plane descended, I replayed every conversation I'd had in recent weeks, Marina's shaky voice as she tried to defend her mother's demands, the clear frustration in my board's warnings, the quiet fear in my own chest about what kind of man I was becoming. By the time we landed, I wasn't afraid of being judged for being poor. I was afraid I might betray myself trying to avoid it. The Whitford estate sat on a ridge overlooking the city, all sandstone walls and towering iron gates. The drive up the long stone path felt like entering another world, a world curated, manicured, and guarded. Marina waited at the front door, stepping into my arms with a familiar kiss, but her body was tense as if she could already feel how the night would unfold. Inside, everything seemed designed to remind visitors where they stood. Sculptures on pedestals framed newspaper clippings about Whitford Industrial's golden years, chandeliers glowing with warm light. I took it all in quietly, aware of how out of place I must have looked in a house built on decades of inherited prestige. Charles found me first. He walked me through the house, pointing out artwork and talking about Arizona golf tournaments, avoiding any mention of the binder Marina had brought to Denver. When we reached his office, he shut the door, sighed, and said, "Things aren't as strong as they look. If Holt hadn't stepped in, we'd have lost more contracts than I care to admit." He smiled in a tired way. "You're the one keeping Whitford afloat, Alistair. If you become family, it eases a lot of concerns." There it was again, that word used not to describe love or belonging, but as a convenience, a strategy. It struck me how much weight he was placing on a future that wasn't his to negotiate. Then came Evelyn. We met in the living room, where she stood by a marble fireplace like she was hosting a political fundraiser. She looked me up and down, evaluating. When Marina introduced me as Alistair, Evelyn extended her hand and said Mr. Holt, correcting her on purpose. Her questions were sharp, dressed in politeness, but aimed like darts. "Is your company properly valued? What's the retirement plan for your parents in Pueblo? What liabilities would you bring into the marriage?" She spoke to me like I was a filing cabinet she needed to audit. Later in the kitchen, Marina tried to make light of it. She joked that her mom interrogates everyone, begged me not to take it, personally told me to keep the night peaceful. But when I asked her if I say no to the money, whose side are you on, she froze. Her silence answered everything. Before dinner, Evelyn asked me to stay behind while everyone else walked toward the dining room. She delivered her message without flinching. "A man who wants to marry my daughter must show he can provide." Every man before you has contributed something substantial. 100,000 is modest, symbolic, and it cleans up the imbalance of your background." Then she smiled slightly. "Consider it disinfecting a poor boy." The words hit harder because I'd heard them before from Marina, softened in retelling. Now they came sharpened, deliberate, meant to slice. My brother's face flashed in my memory. So did the cemetery. So did my vow. I stood there realizing I had only two choices: give in and lose respect for myself, or refuse and risk losing Marina Whitford and the stability of Holt Dynamics. I didn't answer Evelyn. I only said, "After dinner, I think everyone will know exactly who I am." When we finally entered the dining room, the table stretched like a runway beneath the chandelier. White linens, polished glasses, a view of the pool shimmering outside. Marina squeezed my hand under the table, trying to steady us both. I looked at the red wine in front of me, watching how the light caught the surface. Something inside me knew the night was going to spill over and nothing would remain the same after it did. At the far end of the table, Evelyn rose with her glass, and the smile she gave me, sharp, triumphant, expectant, was one I would remember for the rest of my life. The dining room glowed like a staged photograph, white tablecloth, crystal glasses, and a pool shimmering just beyond the windows. Everyone was talking softly until Evelyn lifted her chin and fixed her gaze on me. I could feel Marina tense beside me, but she didn't say anything. Evelyn opened with questions that sounded polite but landed like evaluation criteria. "Pueblo must feel very far from here," she said. "Quite a climb from repairing air conditioners to sitting at this table." Marina tried to smooth things over but never defended me. Just soft jokes. A nervous smile. Nothing more. Halfway through dinner, Evelyn stood, wine glass in hand. "We're here because Alistair wants to join our family," she said. She stepped behind me. Before I could react, the entire glass of red wine splashed across my face, ice cold, sharp, humiliating. That, she said, is to disinfect a poor boy before he enters this house. "If you want to marry my daughter, put $100,000 on the table." Behind the ringing in my ears, I heard laughter, light, startled. Marina's, not cruel but real enough to slice through me. I stood slowly. My face was burning, but my voice wasn't shaking. "Thank you," I said. Not for the wine, but for the clarity. I looked at Charles. "Whitford has relied on Holt Dynamics for years. And tonight, in front of your family, I'm ending every active contract between us." The room snapped to silence. Marina's eyes widened. "Alistair, don't. Mom didn't mean we can fix this," but I gently freed my arm from her grip. "You could have defended me once tonight. You didn't." Then I turned to Evelyn. "You don't get to assign a price to my worth. Not anymore." I set the napkin on the table and walked out. No one followed at first. Outside, the desert air hit my wet shirt as I reached the car. For the first time in years, I cried not for Marina or Whitford, but because I had finally chosen myself. Weeks later, I announced the contract termination inside Holt Dynamics. My team was stunned but relieved. The real surprise came 2 days later. A major Midwest manufacturer, long hesitant to approach us due to our Whitford ties, signed a new multi-year deal. Whitford, meanwhile, unraveled. Their systems stalled without our updates. Clients walked. 6 months in Charles was forced out by the board. A new CEO stripped away perks, sold assets, and removed the Whitford family from daily control. Evelyn lost her social standing. Her friends drifted. She moved to a smaller home. The perfect empire she once used as a weapon crumbled from the inside. Marina reached out constantly, at first calls, texts, long messages about fixing things. I read them sometimes twice but never replied. Not because I hated her, because the silence she gave me at that table said everything. Holt Dynamics tightened its belt for a quarter, then surged forward. A Texas manufacturing group selected us as their primary tech partner, and suddenly the loss of Whitford didn't feel like a loss at all. It felt like cutting free a rusted anchor. In Pueblo one weekend, I stopped to help a group of high school kids struggling with old laptops. One lesson became weekly sessions, and I found a part of myself I'd forgotten, someone who wanted to give, not just endure. 3 years passed. I was 35. The company was thriving. I lived simply, ran in the mornings, mentored in the evenings, visited my parents on weekends. I thought of Marina sometimes, but with distant gratitude rather than pain. One day, a letter arrived from Charles. He apologized for that night for the pressure for his silence. He wrote that my decision forced his family to face truths they'd ignored. He told me Marina was working at a nonprofit earning her life instead of inheriting it. Standing on a cliff overlooking Highway 50, I realized I'd kept the promise I made at 16. No one would ever put a price on me again. Money comes and goes. Contracts begin and end. But the moment you sell your self-respect, you lose everything. I tightened my grip on the rock wall, climbed higher, and breathed in the cold mountain air, finally knowing I owed nothing to anyone except the man I chose to be.
This story really touches on a common fear, being defined by one's birth or wealth. I felt Alistair was a true hero, not because of his financial success, but because of his steadfastness and composure in the face of humiliation. The scene where Evelyn threw the wine made me shudder with its brutality, reflecting how some wealthy families use money to control and degrade others. Marina was unfortunate. She had potential but lacked the courage to stand up for her love, causing the relationship to fall apart not only because of her mother but also because of her silence. Overall, the video had a satisfying karma is real feeling. Whitford's downfall was not accidental, but the result of arrogance. It made me reflect on the real world, where many relationships, personal and business, are driven by profit, and hopefully will inspire viewers to prioritize dignity over compromise. Lessons learned. 3 key lessons I learned from the video, applicable to everyday life. Stay true to your core values, no matter the circumstances. Alistair's 16-year-old oath is a guide. Identify your unbought values early, like self-respect, roots, and protect them. In business or love, small compromises can lead to big losses. Diversify your risk, both personal and professional. Holt Dynamics relied too much on Whitford, and it almost collapsed if it wasn't cut. Lesson: don't let one relationship, family, partner, control your future. Build an independent network to have the leverage when needed. Forgiveness has its limits, but moving forward is key. Alistair didn't respond to Marina or Evelyn, but chose to mentor the younger generation, turning pain into positive action. Don't let your past define you. Use it to lift others up, leading to true growth. This video is not only entertaining but also a powerful reminder. Life is not an auction, but a journey of self-evaluation. If you have watched it, what do you think of Alistair's decision?